We're looking at a book, a very famous book. It begins with a small, curious monkey living happily in Africa. He is swinging on a vine. On the next page, a man appears. A tall man in a bright yellow suit and a wide-brimmed yellow hat. The man watches the monkey. The book tells us the man thinks, "What a nice little monkey. I would like to take him home with me." And then he does something very strange. He places his large yellow hat on the ground, and when the curious monkey comes down to investigate, the man grabs him, stuffs him into a bag, and carries him away. This is the beginning of Curious George. This is the moment the entire story hinges on. It's an act of capture, a non-consensual removal from home. It's presented so simply, so matter-of-factly, that millions of us have read it or had it read to us without ever stopping to ask the obvious question, what are we actually watching happen here? Why does one of the most beloved characters in children's literature begin his story not with friendship, but with abduction? This isn't a rescue. George is not in danger. This is a powerful figure deciding he wants something and simply taking it. That is the anomaly. That is the mystery we are beginning with. The investigation doesn't start with assigning blame or modern judgment. It starts with the evidence on the page. We have to look closely at what the book, published in 1941, is showing us. The first clue is the journey. After being put in the bag, George is taken to a large ship. The man, who we only know as the man with the yellow hat, tells him, "Now you will go to a big city with me. You will like it in the big city." This is a promise made by a captor to his captive. On the ship, George's curiosity immediately gets him into trouble. He sees seagulls, tries to fly like them, and falls overboard into the ocean. He is drowning. Notice the power dynamic here. The man saves him, pulling him from the water with a life preserver. This act of rescue complicates the narrative. The man is now both captor and saviour. He has created the very danger from which he rescues George. George was not in danger in his home in Africa. He was only in danger after being taken, after being placed in an unfamiliar and hazardous environment. This pattern is critical. George's curiosity is consistently framed as the source of his problems, but his problems only exist because he has been forcibly placed in a world he does not understand, and that was not designed for him. When they arrive in the big city, the man's first action is not to take George home. He takes him to his own house, feeds him, and then, while George is sleeping, the man makes a telephone call. We see him on the phone, and the text says he is calling the zoo. "The little monkey," he says, "should be in a good place. The zoo is a good place for a little monkey." So the initial justification for the capture, "I would like to take him home with me," was never the full story. The ultimate destination was always a cage, an institution. George is not a pet or a companion. He is an exhibit. But before the zoo can collect him, George's curiosity again leads to trouble. He finds the telephone, plays with it, and accidentally calls the fire department. When the firefighters burst in, they don't see a curious animal. They see a nuisance, a problem to be dealt with. And what do? They capture him again. They grab him, two large firefighters holding a small monkey, and they take him to prison. Not an animal shelter, a jail for humans. The illustration is stark. George is behind bars, looking out, while a guard stands watch. He is incarcerated for being curious in a world he was forced into. This is another layer of evidence. The systems of the big city are not just confusing to George, they are actively hostile. The telephone, a tool of communication for the man, becomes a trap for George. The fire department, a source of help, becomes a source of punishment. He escapes this prison. using his natural climbing abilities to scale the walls and run across telephone wires. But his freedom is brief. He sees a man selling balloons, and in his curiosity, he grabs the entire bunch and is lifted into the air, floating helplessly over the city. This is the climax of his chaotic journey. He is untethered, floating above a world he cannot navigate. And who finds him? The man with the yellow hat. He just happens to be there, spots the monkey floating by, and calmly retrieves him by pulling the balloons down. Once again, he is both captor and saviour. He has George back in his possession. And now, he finally completes his original plan. He takes George to the zoo. The final page shows George in his new home. He is on a manufactured island with a fake tree, surrounded by a moat of water as people look on. The book tells us he was happy. He had all he wanted, and he did not want to run away. He was a good little monkey and always very curious. So let's synthesize this first layer. The narrative arc of the original Curious George is capture, transport, endangerment, rescue, confinement, accidental transgression, punishment, escape, recapture, and finally, permanent, benevolent institutionalization. Every single event in the story flows from that initial, unprovoked act of abduction. George has no agency. He is acted upon. Things happen to him. His only defining characteristic, his curiosity, is consistently the trigger for his punishment within the new world he inhabits. The story ends by defining his happiness as the acceptance of his confinement. That is the explicit story, the evidence on the page, but that just raises a much deeper question. Why would anyone, let alone two people who were themselves refugees, write a story with this structure? To answer that, we have to move to our second layer of investigation, the creators. The authors were Hans Augusto Rey and Margaret Rey. They were both German Jews, born in Hamburg. They met in Brazil, married, and eventually settled in Paris in the 1930s. They were artists, living a bohemian life in Montmartre. It was there, in Paris, that they created their first stories about a mischievous monkey named Fifi, who would later become George. But in 1940, their lives were shattered. The Nazi army was advancing on Paris. As Jewish citizens, they knew they had to flee. According to Margaret Rey's own accounts, their escape was a desperate, last-minute affair. Hans assembled 2 bicycles from spare parts in the middle of the night. With the German forces closing in, they packed a few essential belongings and their most precious possession, the manuscripts and illustrations for their children's books, including the story that would become Curious George. They pedalled out of Paris just hours before the city fell to the Nazis. They were refugees, fleeing a monstrous regime that saw them as less than human, a regime that would eventually capture and institutionalize millions in camps. Their journey was harrowing. They rode their bicycles south for days, sleeping in barns and struggling to find food. They eventually sold the bicycles for train tickets to the Spanish border, then travelled through Spain to Portugal. From Lisbon, they managed to get passage on a ship bound for Brazil, and finally, from Rio de Janeiro, they made their way to New York City in the fall of 1940. They arrived as displaced people, refugees from a world that wanted to erase them. And one of the very first things they did was secure a publishing contract for their story about the little monkey. It was published in 1941. This is where the investigation deepens, because we are now facing a profound contradiction. How could 2 people who had just escaped a brutal regime of capture and control, who fled for their lives to avoid being rounded up and put in camps, then turn around and publish a children's story that begins with the capture and institutionalization of its protagonist. It seems almost impossible to reconcile. One might expect a story about freedom, about the joy of escape, about the cleverness of the small outwitting the powerful. Instead, they produced a story that, on its surface, seems to endorse the idea of a powerful figure removing a creature from its natural habitat for its own good. Maybe the story is an allegory for their own experience. Is it possible George represents the refugee and the man with the yellow hat represents a benevolent rescuer like the United States, offering a safe haven? This is a hypothesis we have to test. Let's look at the evidence. Does George's experience mirror that of a refugee finding safety? Not really. George is not fleeing any danger. He is taken from a place of safety. He is not seeking asylum. He is captured. The man is not a rescuer in the beginning. He is an abductor. The big city is not a safe haven. It is a place of constant peril, misunderstanding, and punishment for George. The story ends not in freedom, but in a zoo. A comfortable, safe cage, perhaps, but a cage nonetheless. This hypothesis doesn't seem to fit the facts of the story, so we must reject that simple, allegorical reading. The story is not a direct parallel to their escape, but this only makes the question more urgent. If it is not a story about their own experience, then what is it a story about? What cultural narrative were they tapping into? To understand this, we need to move to our third layer of investigation, the broader context of the time. We have to look at the world of the late 1930s and early 1940s, not just its politics, but its popular culture, its assumptions, and its visual language. The world in which the Rays conceived of and wrote Curious George was a world at the apex of European colonialism. Empires like Great Britain and France, where the Rays were living, still controlled vast territories across the globe, particularly in Africa and Asia. The prevailing ideology of colonialism was built on a narrative of benevolent paternalism. It was the story of a civilized world bringing order, progress, and enlightenment to a savage or primitive world. This was the concept often referred to as the white man's burden. Let's examine the visual evidence from that era. We're looking at advertisements, travel posters, cartoons, and illustrations from the 1920s and 30s. A common trope is the image of the Western explorer or adventurer in Africa. And what is he almost always wearing? A pith helmet, a stiff, wide-brimmed hat, often in a shade of khaki or white, designed to protect from the sun. It was the quintessential symbol of the European colonial presence in the tropics. Now, look again at the man with the yellow hat. His hat is not a fedora or a bowler. It is a wide-brimmed, high-crowned hat. It is, in its shape and function, a brightly coloured pith helmet. He is dressed, in essence, in the uniform of the colonial adventurer. The setting is also critical. The story explicitly begins in Africa. Not a specific country, just Africa, the monolithic continent as imagined by the European mind of the era. It is depicted as a jungle, a wild, untamed place. This was the standard colonial representation, a place of nature, not of culture or civilization. George is presented as a part of this nature, a charming but primitive creature to be collected, like a botanical specimen or an exotic mineral. The man with the yellow hat is the agent of civilization who enters this natural world, identifies something of value, and extracts it. This narrative of extraction was central to the colonial project. Explorers and scientists in the employ of empires travelled to Africa to chart its geography, catalogue its flora and fauna, and study its people. This often involved the capture of live animals for zoos back in Europe and America. Zoos, in the colonial era, were not primarily about conservation. They were about exhibition. They were living museums of empire, places where citizens of the colonial power could come and gaze upon the exotic creatures brought back from the far-flung territories they controlled. The zoo was a symbol of imperial reach and power. We can see this exact narrative playing out in Curious George. The man, dressed in the garb of a colonial explorer, travels to the jungle of Africa. He captures a specimen. He transports it back to the metropolis, the heart of civilization, and its final destination is the zoo, the institution of imperial exhibition. The story, viewed through this lens, is not just a whimsical tale. It is a perfect, almost archetypal retelling of the colonial narrative of collection and display. George's happiness in the zoo is the story's justification for the entire project. He is better off here, the book tells us. He is safe. He has all he wants. This is the logic of benevolent paternalism. The captured creature, the colonized subject, is happier and better off under the care of the more civilized power. The Rays were not government propagandists. It's highly unlikely they consciously set out to write a pro-colonial allegory. But artists and writers are products of their time. They absorb the dominant narratives, the unquestioned assumptions, and the visual vocabulary of their culture. The story of the benevolent white man bringing a primitive creature out of the jungle and into the civilized world was a foundational myth of the society they lived in. It was simply in the air. It was a ready-made narrative structure for a story about an animal and a man. They may have reached for it unconsciously because it was a familiar and widely accepted story shape. But this raises an even more disturbing possibility. If the story maps so perfectly onto the logic of colonialism, does it also echo an even darker chapter of that history? This brings us to our fourth and most challenging layer of investigation. We need to look at the specific details of George's journey and compare them to the historical narrative of the transatlantic slave trade. We must proceed carefully here, distinguishing between pattern recognition and claims of authorial intent. We are analysing the text as an artifact. Let's lay out the sequence of events again, this time with a new lens. A being is living freely in Africa. A representative of a foreign, more technologically advanced power arrives. This representative decides he wants to take this being away. The being is captured against its will through a trick. It is put inside a container, a bag, and removed from its home. It is placed onto a large ship for a long voyage across the ocean. This is the Middle Passage. On the ship, the being is in constant danger, unfamiliar with its surroundings, and nearly dies in the water before being saved by its captor. Upon arrival in the new world, the big city, the being is given a new identity. In Africa, he was just a little monkey. It is only in the context of his capture that he is given the name George by his captor. This renaming of the captured is a fundamental element of slavery, an act of stripping away past identity and assigning a new one. The captive is now the property of the one who names him. In this new world, the being's natural behaviours, his curiosity, are constantly misinterpreted as transgressions. He is punished for not understanding the rules of a society he was forced into. His attempts to communicate or interact with the world, like using the telephone, lead to his incarceration. The systems of power, the police and fire departments, are aligned against him. He is seen as a problem to be controlled. His brief taste of freedom, floating away with the balloons, is just that, brief and directionless. He has no power to navigate his own path and is ultimately dependent on his captor to bring him back to Earth. The ultimate fate for the captured being is a life of service and exhibition, contained within a space designed by his captors. The zoo in this reading is the plantation. It is a place of benevolent confinement, where the captive's basic needs are met, but his freedom is completely denied. The narrative assures us he is happy in this state. This justification that the enslaved were better off, cared for, and content in their bondage was one of the central arguments used by defenders of slavery. The story of Curious George seems to follow this horrific historical script with unnerving precision. Let's consider the man with the yellow hat in this framework. He is not depicted as evil. He is kind, patient, and often bails George out of trouble. He is the benevolent master. He is the slave owner who sees himself as a good and caring steward of his property. He believes he is acting in George's best interest. He is taking him to a good place. This lack of malice is perhaps the most insidious part of the narrative. It presents this entire structure of capture, transport, and confinement as a reasonable, even kind act. It sanitizes a story of abduction and turns it into a charming adventure. Again, it is crucial to state that we cannot know what was in the hearts and minds of Hans and Margaret Ray. There is no evidence to suggest they were consciously creating an allegory for slavery. In fact, given their own background as refugees from racist persecution, it seems deeply unlikely. But this is the critical point. The framework of colonialism and the framework of slavery are deeply intertwined. The colonial narrative they seem to have unconsciously adopted carries within it the DNA of the slave trade that preceded it and made it possible. The logic is the same: the extraction of beings from Africa for the use and benefit of the West, justified by a paternalistic belief in the captor's superiority. What we are uncovering here is not a hidden secret message, but the way powerful and often toxic cultural narratives can embed themselves in our stories without our conscious knowledge. The Rays needed a story. They lived in a world where the story of taking a creature from Africa and civilizing it was a common and accepted trope. They likely used that trope without dissecting its horrific origins. They created a story that, regardless of their intent, replicates the narrative logic of one of history's greatest crimes. The very name of the character is another piece of evidence. Why George? He was originally named Fifi in the French edition. The name change happened for the American publication in 1941. According to one popular theory, which is difficult to definitively prove but is compelling, the name might be a subtle, dark joke. In the early 20th century, the term George was used as a generic and often derogatory name for black men, particularly Pullman porters, who were almost exclusively black. To call a porter George was to strip him of his individual name, much like the practice during slavery. Whether the Rays were aware of this slang is unknown, but for a story about a captured African primate brought to America, the choice of the name George is, at the very least, an unsettling coincidence. So, what does this all mean? Does it mean Curious George is a bad book that should be banned? No. The purpose of this investigation is not to cancel or condemn. It is to understand. The book is a cultural artifact. Like an archaeological find, it carries the traces of the world that created it. It tells us something profound about the unquestioned assumptions of the mid-20th century. It reveals how deeply the narratives of colonialism and racial hierarchy were woven into the fabric of Western culture, so deep that they could appear seemingly innocently in a children's book written by victims of racial persecution themselves. The story's enduring popularity is also part of the evidence. Why do we love George? We love him because he is an avatar for the curious child, constantly testing boundaries in a world of adult rules. We identify with his mischief, but in doing so, we tacitly accept the premise of his capture. We accept the man's right to take him. The story works because it persuades us from the very first page that the man's desire to own George is a legitimate and charming motivation. It asks us to co-sign the act of abduction. The subsequent books in the series only reinforce this dynamic. George lives with the man. He is a permanent dependent, a perpetual child in the man's world. He learns to do things like ride a bike and deliver newspapers, but he is always the little monkey in a world of men. He assimilates, but he can never be an equal. He is a beloved pet, an amusing companion, but his status is forever fixed. This is the endpoint of the paternalistic narrative, the domesticated subject who has accepted his subordinate role. We can see how this narrative was subtly softened over time. In later adaptations, particularly the animated television series, the origin story is almost always omitted. We meet George already living with the man in the city. The uncomfortable fact of his capture is erased. The story is sanitized, leaving only the charming mischief of a monkey and his kind, patient owner. This erasure is itself significant. It suggests a growing cultural awareness, a recognition that the original beginning is problematic, that it doesn't sit right with modern sensibilities. But by simply removing it instead of confronting it, we lose the opportunity to understand what the original story reveals about the past. The intellectual irony here is that a story written by refugees fleeing one of the most brutal ideologies of the 20th century ended up reproducing the narrative logic of an older, but equally brutal ideology. The Rays were fleeing a system that categorized people, stripped them of their rights, and sought to confine or eliminate them based on a manufactured hierarchy. Yet, the story they carried with them to freedom was structured around a benevolent hierarchy, a story where one being has the right to capture and confine another for what is framed as its own good. This is not a sign of hypocrisy, but a powerful testament to the insidious nature of deeply embedded cultural narratives. They are harder to escape than any army. So we have travelled from a simple question about a strange moment in a children's book to the complex history of colonialism and slavery. We started with the text itself, the abduction, the journey, the confinement. We then examined the authors, their own harrowing story of escape, creating a deep contradiction. We broadened our view to the colonial context of the 1930s and 40s, recognizing the visual and narrative tropes of the era in the story's DNA. And finally, we uncovered the chilling parallels between George's journey and the historical narrative of the slave trade. What we have discovered is not a secret code, but a latent text, a story beneath the story. The surface story is about a cute monkey and his kindly owner. The subtext, the story that the cultural context reveals, is about capture, displacement, and forced assimilation. It is a story that, regardless of intent, affirms the right of the powerful to control the lives of the other. It is a children's story built on the logic of empire. The journey of this investigation shows us how to read not just books, but the world around us. It teaches us to look for the underlying structures, to question the seemingly innocent premises of the stories we are told. It is not about finding blame, but about finding understanding. The Rays were not villains. They were creative people, refugees working within the cultural vocabulary available to them. But the story they created is a vessel, and it carries the historical baggage of its time. When you encounter Curious George now, you are not just looking at a charming story about a mischievous monkey. You are looking at a complex historical artifact. You are seeing the faint, unsettling echo of a long and brutal history. You are seeing how the logic of capture and control can be laundered into a bedtime story. The story is no less charming, perhaps, but it is profoundly more complicated. And in understanding that complication, we are no longer just passive consumers of a story. We are critical readers of our own culture and the difficult history it was built upon. The curiosity that got George into so much trouble is precisely the quality we need to uncover the stories hidden in plain sight all around us.